I am about to share some facts that still shock historians. It is winter in the Middle Ages. You walk up to the wall, flip the switch, and the room fills with warmth. For us, this is an everyday, automatic action. We perceive heat as something that exists by default at our request. Now imagine that there is no switch, no batteries, no gas, no electricity. All that separates you from the icy breath of the world is the fire in the hearth, and that fire has just gone out. For a medieval person, this was not just a domestic mishap, it was an existential challenge, a direct threat to their very existence. Survival in the medieval winter was not so much a battle as a constant, exhausting management of resources, where heat was the main currency. Fire was the center of the universe, but it was expensive, capricious, and dangerous. Without it, a house became an icy trap. But how did they cope when the flames went out, or when they had to conserve it? They built, dressed, and even ate in ways completely different from what we can imagine. Watch the video to the end to learn how architecture, layered clothing, and a special diet allow people to survive months of cold weather, relying on fire less than we think. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval winters is not true? We are used to thinking about the physical hardships, about the cold itself. But for people of that era, the main challenge was not the temperature, but the darkness. Winter days were short and dim, and nights were almost completely dark and endlessly long. The absence of constant bright light radically changed the perception of the world. Life was reduced to the size of a single room, lit at best by a couple of dim candles or a torch. The world beyond this tiny spot of light ceased to exist, filling with imaginary and very real dangers. This state of constant isolation and sensory deprivation was an enormous test for the psyche. In these conditions, community became the main form of protection. People gathered together in one room, not only for physical warmth, but also for moral support. Working together, such as repairing tools or spinning, became a form of meditation and a way to pass the endless dark hours. It was forced socialization that saved them from despair. Oral traditions and entertainment played a huge role. When physical work became impossible, it was time for stories, songs, and legends. Storytellers were worth their weight in gold. Their words created other worlds, allowing listeners to mentally escape the cold, dark room. It was not just entertainment, but a vital mechanism for psychological relief. The sounds of winter were also perceived differently. Without the background noise we are accustomed to, every creak, every gust of wind, every howl in the chimney sounded deafening. The silence was not relaxing, but tense, full of anticipation. The fire in the hearth was valued not only for its warmth, but also for its quiet crackling, which gave a feeling of life and security. Thus, the first and main line of defense was not the walls of the house, but the human mind. The ability to maintain composure, maintain social connections, and find activities in the dark was no less important than having warm clothes or food supplies. It was not only those who were physically well prepared who survived, but also those who were strong in spirit. This mental survival was the foundation for everything else. People learned to live in tune with nature, accepting darkness as a given. They slowed down their pace of life, immersing themselves in a kind of collective hibernation, active only within the circle illuminated by the hearth. It was an adaptation developed over centuries. The psychological aspect is often overlooked, but it was key. Modern people, accustomed to light and information on demand, would be shocked first and foremost by this all-consuming darkness and silence. The ability to simply be and wait for dawn was a separate art of survival. This experience shaped a special character, more fatalistic and patient. People understood that winter could not be defeated, it could only be endured day after day. Each dawn was perceived as a small victory over darkness, as a promise of future warmth. Activities were strictly regulated by daylight hours. With the onset of twilight, any complex work ceased. Winter was a time for repair, not creation, a time for preservation, not multiplication. And there was wisdom in this. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the psychological aspect of survival in darkness? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel.
He swore he saw a frost giant, but it was only old man Hemlock covered in snow.
Are you ready to learn the truth about how fire was actually obtained and stored? For us, lighting a fire is a matter of one match. In the Middle Ages, it was a laborious process that required skill and special tools. The most common method was to use a flint, a piece of steel that was struck against flint. The spark had to land on tinder, a flammable material such as charred cloth or dry moss. Getting the spark was only half the battle. The tinder had to be fanned into a flame, carefully adding larger and larger chips and logs. This process could take a considerable amount of time, especially if the tinder or wood was even slightly damp. Therefore, fire was not taken for granted, but was valued and cherished. An older, but still used method, friction, was even more difficult. Using a bow drill or other similar devices required tremendous skill and physical effort. Most often, this was the work of a specialist. Losing the fire meant either going through this complicated procedure or going to beg from neighbors. The main task was not to obtain fire, but to preserve it. The hearth was not completely extinguished at night. It was covered. This word has come down to us in European languages. For example, in French, couvre-feu, or English curfew. The hot coals were carefully covered with a thick layer of ash to block the access of oxygen. This method allowed the coals to smolder under the ashes for many hours, sometimes until morning. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes and carefully fan the smoldering remains, adding fresh tinder and small branches. This was much easier and faster than starting a fire from scratch. Losing these smoldering coals was a real domestic disaster. In many settlements, there was a common fire that was kept burning in the smithy or the headman's house. This fire burned constantly, and if someone's hearth went out, they could come with a pot or a special container and borrow burning coals. This was an important part of social mutual aid. Fuel was also a valuable resource. Preparing firewood for the winter was one of the main tasks in the fall. The wood had to be well dried, as wet wood produced more smoke than heat. The right to cut down trees was strictly regulated, and peasants often had to make do with fallen trees or peat. Peat, or turf, was an important fuel in treeless areas, such as Scotland or the Netherlands. It was cut into briquettes and carefully dried throughout the summer. It burned slowly and gave off a steady heat, which was ideal for maintaining a fire, but it also had a distinctive smell. In cities, keeping a fire going was also a matter of public safety. Open fires in dense wooden buildings were a constant threat. There were strict rules requiring all fires to be extinguished or covered after a certain hour to prevent nighttime fires. Thus, life without fire actually meant life with fire that was strictly controlled and accounted for. It was not turned on and off at will. It was cherished, nurtured, and passed on from day to day like a baton of life. But what if I told you that the main secret to survival was not fire, but what people wore? Which of the technologies for preserving fire seems most labor-intensive to you?
The winter is harsh this year. I fear for the crops.
What medieval experts don't talk about is the actual clothing system. Popular culture has created a myth of dirty peasants in rough burlap sacks. The reality was much more complex, technological, and closer to the modern concept of layered clothing than we can imagine. Clothing was the first line of defense against the cold, a personal home that a person wore on their body. It all started with underwear. This layer was critically important and was almost always made of linen. Contrary to popular belief, linen was not only available to the rich. Peasants grew it themselves. The main property of linen is its hygroscopicity, that is, its ability to absorb moisture from the body and dry quickly, preventing the body from overcooling from its own sweat. The main insulating layer was worn over a linen shirt, camisa, and trousers, bure. Here, wool was the queen of materials. Medieval woolen fabrics were very diverse, ranging from coarse cloth to thin and soft fabrics. Wool has a unique property. It continues to warm even when wet, thanks to the structure of its fibers. This woolen layer consisted of a tunic or dress called a cotta. It was not a loose-fitting robe, but often a fairly close-fitting garment to better retain heat. Another layer could be worn over the cotta, such as a surco, an outer dress or cape that added another air pocket for insulation. The legs were insulated just as carefully. Men wore chausses, essentially separate stockings that were attached to the belt. They were also made of woolen fabric. Linen underwear could be worn underneath. This system allowed them to move and work while keeping their legs warm. A key element was the protection of the head, neck, and hands. A huge amount of heat escapes through the head, and medieval people understood this perfectly well. They wore a variety of hoods, often with a long cape covering the shoulders and neck. Linen caps were also common and were worn even indoors. Outerwear was the final barrier. The most common was the cloak, a simple piece of thick woolen fabric, often impregnated with wax or fat to make it waterproof. It could be used as a blanket at night and as protection from wind and snow during the day. This versatility was key to survival. Footwear was another important element. Leather boots made using the turned-out shoe technique were relatively soft. To insulate them from the cold and wet ground, several pairs of woolen socks or footcloths were used. Pattens, wooden sandals worn under leather shoes to raise the foot above mud and slush were also common. The secret of this system was not in the thickness of a single layer, but in the number of air layers between several thin layers. Linen wicked away moisture, wool kept you warm, and the outer cloak protected you from the wind. This well-thought-out cabbage system allowed people to work actively outdoors without freezing or overheating. Inside the house, people did not take off most of these clothes. They could take off the outer cloak but remained in several layers, including headgear. The house was only protection from the wind, but the temperature inside did not differ much from the street temperature if the hearth was not burning brightly. This personal thermal fortress was with them 24 hours a day. If you learned something new about medieval fashion, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the video where we take a detailed look at other aspects of survival in the Middle Ages. Are you ready for the shocking truth about medieval houses? We often imagine either majestic but cold stone castles or flimsy, drafty shacks. In fact, the dwelling of a common person was a surprisingly effective heat trap. Its design had been refined over centuries specifically to conserve precious heat with a minimum of fuel. The basis of a peasant's house was not stone masonry, but the technology of wattle and daub. First, a sturdy wooden frame was erected. The space between the beams was filled with wattle made of flexible rods, which served as reinforcement. This wattle was covered on both sides with a thick layer of daub. The composition of this plaster was the key to insulation. It was a mixture of clay, straw, sand, and other available organic materials. When dried, this composite material had low thermal conductivity, meaning it did not allow heat to escape very well. Walls, several tens of centimeters thick, worked like modern insulation. The roof was another important element. It was almost always covered with straw or reeds. A thick layer of straw roofing, reaching half a meter, was an incredibly effective insulator. It not only protected from rain, but also retained the warm air rising from the hearth, preventing it from escaping. Windows were the Achilles heel of any dwelling. In peasant houses, they were very small to minimize heat loss. Glass was an unimaginable luxury, so window openings were covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or thin plates of horn. At night and in bad weather, they were closed tightly, plunging the house into darkness but keeping it warm. In wealthier homes and castles, textiles were used to combat drafts. Heavy wool tapestries were hung on cold stone walls, not only for beauty, but also as an additional layer of insulation. They blocked cold radiation from the stone and kept out drafts. The floors in simple houses were earthen. They were carefully tamped down, sometimes mixing the earth with clay. Such a floor, being below the level of soil freezing, had a relatively stable temperature on its own. For additional insulation and hygiene, the floor was covered with a thick layer of straw or dry grass, which was changed regularly. The layout of the house was also designed to conserve heat. Often, the dwelling consisted of one large room with a hearth in the center. This arrangement allowed the heat to spread in all directions. Doors were made low and narrow so that as little cold air as possible would enter when they were open. In many designs, the living quarters for people were on the second floor, while valuable workers spent the winter on the first floor. The heat they gave off rose upward and provided additional heating for the floor of the living room. This simple but effective passive heating system was widespread in many regions. There was not always a chimney. In the early Middle Ages, smoke from the central hearth escaped through a simple hole in the roof. Although this created smoke, it also meant that hot air and smoke were trapped under the roof, giving maximum heat to the room before escaping outside. These houses were not comfortable by our standards. They were dark, cramped, and often smoky, but they served their main purpose. They allowed families to survive the winter using a minimum of fuel. But how did they heat these houses if fire was so expensive? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of medieval central heating. Are you surprised by how well thought out their architecture was? When we talk about heating, we imagine an open fire and a hearth. However, constantly burning wood was wasteful and, in urban conditions, dangerous. Therefore, medieval people actively used technologies that allowed them to obtain heat without a constant open flame. One of the most common was the brazier. A brazier was a metal or ceramic basin on legs, which was filled with hot coals. The key fuel here was not wood, but charcoal. Its advantage is that it burns almost without smoke, while emitting a huge amount of even, constant heat. This made it possible to use braziers in living rooms without the risk of suffocation. The process of producing charcoal was a separate industry. Wood was slowly burned in special pits or ovens with limited oxygen access. The result was a light, porous material that was essentially pure carbon. This charcoal was easier to transport and store than firewood. Braziers were mobile. They could be moved from room to room, creating localized areas of warmth. Family members could gather around the brazier to warm their hands and feet. In wealthy homes, braziers were true works of art, made of bronze and decorated with ornaments. However, this method had a huge drawback: carbon monoxide. Charcoal, which burned without smoke, still emitted deadly carbon monoxide. Medieval people were aware of this danger. Rooms with braziers had to be ventilated periodically, even at the expense of heat loss. In the wealthiest homes, and more importantly in monasteries, a technology inherited from the Roman Empire was preserved: the hypocaust. It was a complex underfloor heating system. In essence, it was a furnace located in the basement, with smoke and hot air circulating through special channels under the floor. Stone or ceramic floor tiles were heated from below and evenly distributed heat throughout the room. It was incredibly efficient and comfortable, the real warm floor of the Middle Ages. The air in the room remained clean as the smoke was vented outside through special pipes in the walls. Of course, the construction and maintenance of a hypocaust required enormous resources and engineering knowledge. Therefore, such a system was only available to very wealthy institutions, such as large monasteries, where monks had to spend long hours in scriptoria copying books. It was the pinnacle of heating technology of that era. The most accessible and universal source of heat was the human body itself. In communal living, this heat was used to the maximum. People slept close to each other, often on large shared beds or benches, covered with one large blanket. The combined heat of their bodies significantly reduced heat loss during sleep. Hot water bottles were used to warm beds before bedtime. These could be special metal or ceramic vessels filled with hot water. A simpler option was to heat smooth stones by the hearth, wrap them in cloth, and place them under the blanket. This simple device allowed people to lie down in a warm bed, which was a great relief. Guess what happened next when people ran out of fresh food? Winter was a time not only of cold, but also of hunger. The harvest had long been gathered, and the main task was to preserve it until spring. Without refrigerators and canning factories, medieval people developed surprisingly effective preservation methods that allowed them to eat for many months. People prepared for this challenge in advance. In the fall, villages were filled with the smells of smoke, salt, and spices, because every family knew that their lives depended on proper preparations. Rural life revolved around one question: would there be enough food until the new harvest, or would the frost bring disaster? Salt was the main preservative. Salt was a strategic commodity, the white gold of the Middle Ages. Control over salt mines or salt delivery routes could make a city or feudal lord incredibly rich. Without salt, it was almost impossible to survive the winter. It was delivered from far away, with caravans carrying salt crossing entire countries. Sometimes a bag of salt costed more than a bag of grain. In cities located on trade routes, salt warehouses were guarded like fortresses. After all, losing salt reserves meant condemning people to hunger and disease. The main methods were dry salting and soaking in brine. Meat was rubbed with salt and spices, placed in barrels and stored in a cool place. Fish, especially herring and cod, was also salted in huge quantities. This salted meat and fish formed the basis of the protein diet in winter. Such supplies were often transported to fairs. The smell of barrels of salted fish could be smelled from hundreds of steps away. For peasants, this was food that could save them from starvation, and for merchants, it was a source of great income. Sometimes salt was mixed with herbs and pepper to improve the taste and extend the shelf life. Another important method was smoking. Smoke not only added flavor to the products, but also had powerful bactericidal properties. Meat and fish were hung in special smokehouses or simply in the chimney above the hearth. Cold smoking allowed food to be stored for months. In some homes, the smokehouse was part of the kitchen, and the smell of smoked meat filled the house with a warm, cozy aroma. Smoke protected food not only from decay, but also from insects. In wealthy homes, meat was smoked with the addition of juniper and oak chips to give it a special flavor. Drying was the oldest and most accessible method. Grains, legumes, mushrooms, fruits, and berries were laid out in the sun or dried in a cooling oven. Dried products contained almost no moisture, which stopped the growth of mold and bacteria. Thick soups were made from dried peas and beans. In autumn, courtyards were littered with baskets of apples, pears, and mushrooms, all of which were dried for weeks. People knew how important it was not to overdry the harvest in order to preserve its taste and nutritional value. Such products were light, could be taken on the road, and often saved travelers and warriors from hunger. Every house had a cellar or root cellar. It was a room dug into the ground, where a low but stable temperature was maintained all year round. Root vegetables were stored here: turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets. They were often sprinkled with sand to prevent them from drying out and rotting. The walls of the cellar were made of stone or wood, and the ceiling was reinforced to prevent it from collapsing under the weight of snow. Inside, there were shelves where vegetables, apples, and cabbage were stored in clay pots and bags. When blizzards raged outside, going down into the cellar was like entering another world. Cool, quiet, and full of the smells of earth and fresh vegetables. Fermentation, or pickling, was another ingenious method of preservation. The most famous example is sauerkraut. Cabbage was chopped, rubbed with salt, and left under pressure. The lactic acid bacteria that developed during the process not only preserved the cabbage, but also enriched it with vitamins, which was critically important in winter. Fermented foods helped people avoid vitamin deficiency and maintain their strength. In addition to cabbage, cucumbers, apples, and beets were also fermented. The taste of such food was reminiscent of summer and lifted the spirits during the darkest months. Dairy products were also preserved. Milk spoiled quickly, so it was processed into cheese and butter. Hard cheeses could be stored for months, only getting better with time. Butter was churned and stored in a salted form in ceramic pots. Every village had women who knew how to make cheese, and they were respected for this gift. Sometimes the cheese was dried, turning it into hard wheels that could be taken on the road. Even a small amount of this product was a valuable source of protein and fat in the winter diet. In addition to drying, fruit was also preserved in honey. Honey, with its antiseptic properties, was the ideal medium for storing berries and pieces of fruit. It was an expensive delicacy, not available to everyone, but very effective. Wealthy households made entire stocks of candied fruit in clay pots, which were only opened on holidays. Honey preserved not only the taste but also the aroma of summer. Sometimes spices were added to the honey to give the treat a special delicacy. In the next chapter, you will learn what drinks helped them survive the winter. Which of these storage methods do you think is the most reliable? Survival in winter is primarily a battle for calories. Food was not just a source of satiety, it was fuel for the body's internal heater. The medieval winter diet was designed to provide maximum energy with minimum preparation. The lack of a constant fire meant that food was not cooked as often, but when it was done thoroughly. The basis of the cuisine was pottage. It was a thick porridge or soup that was cooked in a single cauldron. The cauldron often hung over the hearth constantly. Everything that was available was thrown into it. Grain, oats, barley, dried legumes, root vegetables from the cellar, and if lucky, a little salted meat or bones for broth. The uniqueness of this porridge was that it was rarely cooked from scratch. The pot was almost never emptied completely. Every day, new ingredients and water were added to it. It could simmer and stew over low heat or smoldering coals for hours, even days. It was a constantly updated, always hot and nutritious meal. Bread was the second pillar of the diet, but it was not the fluffy white bread we know. Most people ate heavy, dense bread made from rye or a mixture of grains. It was incredibly filling and high in calories. Bread was often baked not every day, but once a week in a large village or monastery oven to save firewood. Stale bread was not thrown away. It was used as a base for other dishes. Pieces of stale bread were placed in a bowl and poured over with hot soup or ale. It would soak, turning into a filling porridge. Bread also served as a plate in wealthy homes, absorbing the juices from meat. Ale or beer was a critically important drink. In the Middle Ages, it was not so much an alcoholic beverage for fun as it was liquid bread. It was high in calories, nutritious, and most importantly, safe. Water from rivers or wells was often contaminated, and the fermentation process killed most pathogens. Ale was drunk by everyone, young and old, in large quantities. In winter, it was often drunk warm, heated with the addition of spices. It was a great way to warm up quickly and get a dose of easily digestible calories. Ale production was an important household chore, usually done by women. Salted meat and fish required lengthy preparation. Before cooking, they had to be soaked for hours in several changes of water to remove excess salt. They were then stewed or boiled for a long time in the same broth to soften the tough meat. Spices, available to the wealthy, also played a role. Pepper, ginger, and cloves. These hot spices were believed to help warm the body from within. For commoners, this role was fulfilled by local herbs, as well as garlic and onions, which were valued for their pungent taste and health benefits. Honey was the main sweetener. It was added to drinks and porridge. Sugar was an exotic and incredibly expensive luxury. Honey, on the other hand, was affordable and valued for its preservative and healing properties. Thus, the winter diet was monotonous but nutritious. It was built around slow-cooking, high-calorie dishes that could be maintained with minimal fuel consumption. Hot, thick soup and a mug of warm ale were the basis of survival during the cold months. When we talk about fire, we often forget its second most important function: light. If the absence of heat was a physical threat, the absence of light threatened mental balance and the very possibility of leading a normal life. Medieval nights were dense and thick, almost tangible, and the darkness seemed like a living creature breathing around people. Without light, it swallowed all shapes and sounds, making people feel anxious and lonely. Even the bravest tried not to go outside after sunset. The world turned into a black abyss. Fighting this darkness was a real art and a constant concern. Winter daylight hours were short, and every hour of daylight was extremely valuable. People rose with the first rays of the sun to get as much done as possible. Working in the fields, building, spinning, wood carving, or blacksmithing, everything depended on how much light remained. After sunset, life seemed to freeze, and only the most necessary tasks continued to be done by the hearth. For many families, evening meant the end of activity, a time for dinner, prayer, and sleep. Sunlight was a treasure, and its departure was a reminder of man's dependence on nature. The cheapest and most common source of light was a splinter. It was a simple piece of dry wood, sharpened at one end and fixed in a cleft or holder. Its fire was dim, with a reddish, smoky flame. But for poor people, it was the only light available. Tinder quickly burned out, leaving behind the smell of smoke and soot on the walls. Sometimes several tinder were placed at the same time to illuminate the room at least a little. However, their light was barely enough to see the faces of those sitting by the hearth. The process of preparing splinters was almost a craft. It was necessary to find resinous wood, most often pine, less often spruce or juniper. The splinters were chopped with an axe, carefully dried, and stacked in bundles under a canopy. In the fall, whole stacks were prepared to last for long winter evenings. When the family gathered around the fire, someone kept an eye on the kindling, adding new pieces as soon as the old ones burned out. This work was continuous. One piece of kindling could burn out in 10 minutes, and the night turned into a constant series of lighting and sighing. The next most accessible source of light was tallow candles. They were made by hand from beef or mutton fat, which was melted in large cauldrons. A wick made of hemp or flax was dipped repeatedly into the melted fat until a thick layer formed. Making candles was a difficult and dirty job. The fat cooled quickly, requiring constant reheating. The smell was heavy, but on long winter evenings, even such a candle seemed like a miracle. Each candle was the result of hours of work and was not wasted. Tallow candles burned longer than torches, but their light was uneven and capricious. The flame often smoked, and the wax dripped onto the floor with a crackle. The wick had to be constantly trimmed or adjusted with tongs to prevent it from going out. Soot from the candles settled on ceilings and fabrics, and the smell of fat permeated clothing. Nevertheless, tallow candles remained a symbol of comfort and prosperity. They were affordable for families of craftsmen and wealthy peasants. The light from such a candle was dim, but it created a feeling of protection from the darkness. Beeswax candles were considered a real luxury. They burned evenly, produced almost no smoke, and exuded a pleasant honey aroma. The wax flame was soft and golden, and its light seemed almost magical in a world where darkness was everywhere. But beeswax was expensive. It was difficult to obtain, as apiaries required care and experience. Most of the wax went to churches, where candles burned before altars and icons. For ordinary people, a wax candle was almost a symbol of heavenly light, accessible only to the chosen few. Only the richest feudal lords and merchants could afford to light their homes with such candles every day. In castles and city mansions, they were placed in copper or silver candelabra and candlesticks. In the evening, the hall was filled with soft light, reflected in expensive fabrics and gold. For poor people, the only place to see a burning wax candle was in church. Therefore, its flame was associated not with everyday life, but with celebration and prayer. The light of a wax candle was a sign of power and wealth, a rare glow in a sea of darkness. Simple oil lamps, inherited from antiquity, were also used. These were small clay or metal vessels filled with vegetable oil, most often olive oil if the region allowed it. A wick was placed inside, which absorbed the oil and gave off an even but dim flame. Such lamps smoked and often emitted an unpleasant odor if the oil was of poor quality. However, they could be made by hand and were more convenient than torches. In poor homes, lamps became the main source of light, especially in southern countries. Due to the high cost and inefficiency of lighting, most people simply went to bed when darkness fell. The night dictated its own rhythm, and life was subject to the sun. People fell asleep early, slept for a long time, 10, 12 hours, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night to talk, pray, or light a fire. It was a natural way of life in a world where every ray of light was hard-earned. Winter evenings were a time for rest, reflection, and sleep. Darkness filled homes with silence, and people accepted it as part of life, not as an enemy. Work requiring precision was done only by the hearth, where a living flame played. Darkness shaped a special attitude toward the world. People felt the boundaries between day and night much more acutely than we do. For them, light was not just a convenience, but a symbol of life and hope. We have talked about fire as a source of salvation, but it was also one of the main dangers of medieval life. Surviving without fire could sometimes be safer than handling it ineptly. The constant struggle for warmth had a dark side that is often forgotten. The main threat was fire. Most buildings, especially in cities, were made of wood and stood close together. The roofs were covered with straw. A single spark from a chimney or an overturned candle could lead to a catastrophe that destroyed entire neighborhoods. Firefighting equipment was very primitive. It mainly consisted of buckets of water passed along a chain and long hooks used to pull apart burning buildings to stop the fire from spreading. A fire on a windy winter day was virtually uncontrollable. The fear of fire was so great that many cities had strict rules in place. The curfew, or fire cover hour, was not a recommendation but a law. At night, special patrols walked the streets to ensure that all fires were extinguished or securely covered. Another invisible threat was smoke. In the early Middle Ages and in the homes of the poor, fireplaces with chimneys were rare. The hearth was located in the center of the room, and the smoke escaped through a special opening in the roof or simply seeped through the thatched roof. This meant that the room was constantly smoky. The air was acrid, irritating the eyes and lungs. The walls and ceiling quickly became covered with a thick layer of sticky soot. People literally lived in smoke, which had long-term consequences for their health. Even the advent of fireplaces did not completely solve the problem. Their design was still imperfect, and most of the heat escaped up the chimney, while some of the smoke still entered the room. The efficiency of such fireplaces was very low. They provided psychological comfort rather than actual warmth. We can see that survival in the medieval winter was a complex, multifaceted system. It was not a desperate struggle between man and the cold, but rather a well-oiled mechanism of adaptation developed over centuries. The lack of a constant flame on demand was compensated for by ingenious solutions in other areas. Clothing was personal architecture, the house was collective armor against the elements, and food was internal fuel. The social structure that forced people to stick together was as important a factor in survival as the supply of firewood. Fire was not a panacea, but a valuable yet dangerous resource that required constant management. What other topics from medieval life or other historical eras would you like us to cover? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.